Welcome to MMAfighting.com's UFC 118 preview show alongside Mike Chiappetta. I'm Ariel Helwani, and we're coming at you from the historic Faneuil Hall in Boston, Massachusetts. We're just a couple blocks from here. Saturday night at the TD Garden, the UFC will make their long-awaited Beantown debut. And Mike, so many storylines going into this event. James Toney making his UFC debut, and no disrespect to BJ and Frankie, but let's start right there. Dana White has often said this is a freak show. He's often said, I don't know why I've made this match. At this point, a few days away from the fight, can you understand, given all the hype surrounding this fight, why the UFC booked this fight?
Obviously, it's very understandable. I mean, UFC is getting mainstream attention with this fight. Leading up to this week, Dana White's been on SportsCenter. The fight's been talked about a lot in mainstream radio, which is not something we always see with UFC events. And around here, there's been a buzz around Boston already. We've only been here for a short time, but there's a buzz around the city already. And I think people are really interested. Even though this is sort of a question that should have been answered at UFC 1, what's the best style of combat art, it's still something people are interested in. We always love to see a style clash, and this is a style clash of the highest order.
The detractors out there will say, how does a guy who is 0-0 walk into the octagon and face a guy like Randy Couture, multiple-time champion? We've seen guys like Brock Lesnar walk in there with, not that many fights on their record, but do you think it is bad for the sport to have Toney at 42 years old walk into the sport with a record of 0-0?
That's such a difficult question to answer. I think that you look at his combat sports experience. I mean, being an extremely decorated fighter, even boxers marvel at what this guy has done during the course of his career as far as having some of the best hands in boxing history, moving up so many weight classes and being successful at so many different weight classes. So this is a guy who's been super successful at a really tough art. Now, obviously, mixed martial arts is completely different. But as you said, someone like Brock Lesnar came in really just with wrestling as a background, was a champion within a couple fights of his UFC debut. So not to say that James Toney's going to do the same thing, but if we give opportunities to some guys, why not give him a chance to see what he can do? I mean, James Toney is in his early 40s here. He doesn't have a lot of time to sit back and try and learn everything and then come in. So I think, first of all, we just have to give him a ton of credit for having the guts to do this, because a lot of boxers badmouth MMA for a long time. He's the only one to sign on the dotted line and to put his reputation out there. So you got to give him a lot of credit. Whether it's a freak show or not, I think that's for each individual to judge.
I know you're a man who likes to look at the betting lines, and it seems as though right now it's like, all right, people have just kind of forgotten about the fact that Couture is a huge favorite. The most interest, or maybe the line that's getting the most action, is, can Toney make it past the first round? What do you think?
I think it's probably unlikely. I will say, though, that since the fight was first announced, the betting lines have gone towards Toney. The money has come on the underdog so far. I think that's probably because the lines were so high that they seem, you have to wonder, we saw Ray Mercer knock out Tim Sylvia. So it's certainly possible that a boxer can knock out a mixed martial artist with one good punch. And James Toney has as good hands as anybody in boxing, even at this advanced age. So I think that it's very unlikely that James makes that of a round, just because if the fight goes to the ground, and we know Randy's the master of taking it there, if it goes to the ground, I just don't feel like he's going to have any firepower to combat what Randy does.
Perhaps also due to some of the trash talk that he's put out, some pretty classic stuff by James Toney. Obviously, we know what James Toney's strengths are. He's a boxer. He hasn't fought on the ground before. He doesn't have a wrestling background or anything. We know what he can do. If you are Randy Couture, what do you do? The moment that bell rings, what is your game plan?
I think it's pretty simple. I think he's got to try and stay away from James's hand. He's probably going to try and close the distance as soon as possible. Maybe he'll try and throw a couple kicks early, which is something James, doesn't see in boxing, just to take him out of his normal rhythm of trying to gauge distance. James is used to a boxing distance. The distance in MMA is a little bit different. Maybe throw some kicks at him, make up that distance and clinch against the fence. Randy's the master of that Greco-Roman takedown, and we've seen him do it to everybody. No matter how big they are, he's been able to take down pretty much everybody he's ever been in there with against. And like we said, as soon as he takes it down, it's probably lights out for lights out.
If James Toney does win, though, he has said that he still wants to go back to boxing. He wants fights against the likes of David Haye, the Klitschko brothers, whatever. If he does win, though, should Dana White convince him to stick around and put him in other big fights against guys like maybe, Roy Nelson, Frank Mir, those kind of guys?
If he wins, you have to. I mean, if you beat Randy Couture, even at Randy Couture's advanced age, he's 47 years old, and it's still Randy Couture. I mean, this is a 5-time champion. That's an incredible, and I think people will be blown away if James Toney finds a way to win. And so if he finds a way to solve someone that's as good as Randy Couture in every phase of the game, maybe he doesn't have James Toney striking, but he's a decent boxer. And everything else that Randy brings to the equation, if he's able to win, even if it's kind of a fluky one-punch knockout, people are going to want to see him again. So I think the UFC will be guns a-blazing to bring him back for another fight and bring him back against a high-profile opponent.
Who wins and how?
I think Randy wins. I'm thinking it's either going to be a first-round TKO or a rear naked choke. Maybe he takes him down, and he loves the half guard, throws the elbows, and again, something James isn't used to. Maybe James turns his back. But I'm thinking James is he's more of a proud type. He's probably not going to turn his back. He's probably just going to take the beating until the referee pulls him away. But again, I do want to say I give James Toney a ton of credit just for stepping in here with Randy, because so many guys have called out MMA. He's the first one to do it. He deserves props for that, win or lose.
Moving to the top of the card now, does a part of you feel a little bad for Frankie Edgar? Because in Abu Dhabi, his win over BJ Penn was really overlooked due to the Anderson Silva fight. Now his fight is kind of being overlooked again because of James Toney and Randy Couture. And, it just seems as though it's like there's a title fight happening. There's a belt up there, but all the questions are going to James Toney, Randy Couture. Does a kind of part of you feel a little bit bad for this guy?
I think it's a little bit unjust and unfair because he is the champion. And not only that, but he's the underdog in the fight when he's the champion, which is not something we see too often. But at the same time, I have a feeling that it's not something that Frankie minds. He's a really quiet, understated guy. He likes to just kind of take care of his own business and doesn't worry about the hype and everything else. He just takes care of business. So to me, I kind of feel like this is the kind of setting that Frankie's comfortable with. He doesn't have to carry the show in terms of the promotion. He's got plenty of other guys to do that. BJ's always a great quote. James Toney's obviously a great quote. And having Randy Couture, basically the godfather of MMA, he's almost like the fourth most important guy here, which is crazy to say because he's the only one defending a belt. But I think that's probably something that Frankie is happy and content with. He doesn't have to carry the show.
Okay, first, let's just put it out there. Who do you think won the first fight?
I scored the fight for Frankie, 48-47, but it was an extremely close fight, and I really couldn't argue too much for people who saw it, 48-47 for BJ. It was extremely close.
Now, at this point, we all know that both those guys walked into the fight not exactly at 100%. They both had issues going into the fight. Who are you expecting to step up their game on Saturday night, BJ or Frankie?
Well, I think both of them will look a little better. I think one of the things that kind of been forgotten in all this is that fight took place in the extreme heat, one of the first outdoor fights in UFC history. And I think that could have impacted them as well in the late rounds, as well as having the injuries and the illnesses that they dealt with. So I think we're going to see a different fight just because that's not a factor here. Heat is a factor in every other sport. Why wouldn't it be in MMA? Now that's not a problem in an environment like that's controlled temperature-wise. So I think we'll see a relatively similar fight. One thing that we know is Frankie's the quicker fighter. Frankie's got quick hands. This is something he's had to do throughout his career. He's always been the smaller guy, so he's had to be the quicker guy. So it's something he's kind of made a career out of. So BJ's going to kind of have to be the one to adjust and adapt, but it's hard to get quicker. Even though BJ has quick hands, not as quick as Frankie. So I think that's the biggest thing he needs to do is to combat that quickness. Maybe he's going to rely more on clinch work and try and rough Frankie up a little bit in a clinch, or maybe even look for takedowns of his own. We've seen him do that in the past. BJ's capable of it. He's a good wrestler, even though he doesn't use it a lot. So I think there are a couple things he can do to kind of try and take Frankie out of that rhythm that he had in the first fight.
Frankie obviously pulled off a huge upset. Very few people gave him a shot at UFC 112. Does he pretty much do the exact same thing that he did in Abu Dhabi this time around?
I think he'll have a similar game plan. Of course, I'm sure he'll have a few wrinkles up his sleeves because you don't want to come in with exactly the same thing. You want to give BJ a few new things to think about. Maybe he'll look for takedowns a little bit more in the first fight. He only shot in here and there. In other fights, he's been more active with the takedown. Maybe he'll come out with the takedown early in this fight. Just give BJ something else to think about instead of letting his hands go. And all those things slow down a fighter and make Frankie's hands even faster because that other person's worried about what level he's coming from, and all of a sudden Frankie's landing a combo. So I think there's a lot of factors at play here, and I think Frankie's speed is just something could be a little overwhelming here.
So am I correct in assuming that you were picking Frankie Edgar again on Saturday?
I'm going to pick Frankie again. I didn't pick him the first time around, but I think I really learned a lot about him in that fight, and I think that first of all, he's not afraid of the big stage. You know, I think one thing is you come in, you face somebody who's a legend like BJ. Frankie gives all the respect to BJ in the world, but he's not afraid of him once you get in the ring. Some guys are, that aura kind of works against them. They're nervous, they're scared. You don't see that from Frankie at all. Also, maybe I'm reading too much into this, I don't know, but BJ seems to me, he's in a really interesting frame of mind. He's very reflective the last couple of weeks, every press conference stuff we've been a part of. I don't know. I can't really tell if that's good or bad for him. You know, he's a Hawaiian. Hawaiians tend to be mellow. Maybe that's good. I don't know. But is that good when you're fighting? I don't know. I'm sure he could turn it up. But it's just something that's putting a little more doubt in my mind. And so I'm going to pick Frankie. I think, like I said, the speed was a problem the first time, and it could be a problem the second time out too. And I think it's going to take Frankie to another decision win.
Gray Maynard walks into his fight against Kenny Florian with a huge chip on his shoulder. I mean, he thinks that he was overlooked in that title fight. He has a win over Frankie Edgar. Why wasn't he fighting for the title? He's kind of saying now, you know, I fought in January, I wasn't going to be ready, but you have to think that he was a little annoyed that he was overlooked. Now he's walking into this fight. He's fighting Kenny Florian, who has looked great in his last 2 fights since losing to BJ Penn. What does Gray Maynard need to do to knock Florian off this block? Because like I said, Florian has looked great since teaming up with TriStar. B, he's the hometown boy. This is a huge deal for him to be fighting in Boston.
Well, I think first and foremost, you've got to put Kenny on his back, which is easier said than done. Kenny's wrestling has improved tremendously over the last couple of years. I know a lot of people still think about that Sean Shirk fight and Sean Shirk taking Kenny down over and over and over. But that fight's a few years ago now, and that's one of the big holes that Kenny knew he had. He's addressed it. That's not to say that Gray can't take him down. I think he probably will at some point in the fight. But he's going to have to take him down and hold him there and try and work him over from the top. And Kenny's proved to be a tough person to do that to in the last couple of years. And especially, you know, he's always got those vicious elbows from the bottom. He's got an active guard. It's a tough fight for Gray because I think that Kenny's stand-up is a little more varied. Gray has good boxing. He's got powerful hands. But I think Kenny's got a little bit more varied striking game when it comes to his Muay Thai and his kickboxing and those things. So it's kind of an interesting style clash, and I think Gray's got to try and take the fight down as often as he can.
Dana White has said that if Gray wins this fight, he's the next in line for the title. He also said, though, that if Kenny wins his fight, he's the next in line. And I think that's kind of interesting. I mean, Kenny, lost at UFC 101. That was just, after this fight will be 3 fights ago. And he also has lost to Sean Shirk, both times for the title. Both times he came out on the losing end. Do you agree with the fact that if he looks good on Saturday and wins, that he should deserve a 3rd crack at the title?
Well, yes, and only for the reason, who else would we give it to? I think probably the only other guy who has a legitimate claim is George Sotiropoulos at this point. So if Kenny beats Gray, who was thought to be a possible number 1 contender, like you said, after his last fight, and now he beats him now, who else does he have to beat? I mean, I know, sometimes fans get frustrated if they see the same faces in title fights all the time, but the fact of the matter is, he's only lost to guys who are holding belts, so he's basically championship level. He's just had a problem getting over that last hump. And, it seems to me like one of these times he's going to do it. If he can beat Gray Maynard, he definitely deserves another chance.
A bunch of other interesting fights on the card. Mario Miranda, Damian Maia, also Gabe Rudiger returning to fight Joe Lozon. A bunch of interesting fights. Marcus Davis, Nate Diaz. Any other fight on the card that you're really looking forward to?
I'm actually looking forward to the Mario Miranda, Damian Maia fight. Just because I'm thinking this could be kind of a trap fight for Maia. He was preparing for Alan Belcher, and the opponent is a little bit lesser in status. Miranda's not that well known by fans. Everyone knows Alan Belcher. He's been in the UFC for a couple of years now. Miranda's not that well known. He's had 2 fights. He lost his first fight. He bounced back really well his last time, and I think it could be kind of an interesting test for Maia because Miranda's got really powerful striking, really strong hands, and he's not one of these guys who's going to be so overwhelmed on the ground as a lot of guys are against Maia. He's a BJJ black belt. He's been into Abu Dhabi and fought in that grappling competition. So he's a pretty high-level grappler. So if the fight goes to the ground, we can't assume it's over like we do with some other guys facing Damian. So to me, this is one I kind of have on my upset radar here.
All right, they are tearing this place down. That means we've got to go. Great stuff going down this Saturday night live on pay-per-view from the TD Garden in Boston. Boston, Massachusetts, the UFC's debut here, and they have brought out the big guns. James Toney, like we said, Randy Couture, Gray Maynard, Kenny Florian, Frankie Edgar, BJ Penn. A really great card. The action kicks off 9 p.m. Eastern on Spike TV, then 10 p.m. on pay-per-view. For Mike Chiappetta, I'm Ariel Helwani saying so long from Boston.